news yesterday.
That's good.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mark Obenchain. I'm state senator from the Central Shenandoah Valley. I used to be chairman of the Courts of Justice Committee of the Virginia State Senate, and I'm still chairman of the Virginia State Crime Commission. I want to welcome you to the second day of our Parole Spotlight series. The Northern administration is seemingly using the COVID crisis to perhaps as cover for the release of a rather stunning array of murderers, rapists, and other violent felons decades before the end of their sentences. And they're doing this without input from victims or prosecutors. And I point out that just yesterday, the Richmond media reported that another story about a murderer who was set free 10 years into a sentence without proper notice or input from victims or the prosecutors, and the family of that murder victim were in Chesterfield, Virginia. Another in a long series of stories that have been coming out over the course of the past month. Today, I'm pleased to have with us Phil Ferguson. Phil is a longtime Commonwealth attorney for Suffolk. Phil, it's great to have you with us.
It's great to be with you, Mark.
Phil, let's just jump right in. You have received notice from the Department of Corrections or the Parole Board about the release of not just one, not just two, but how many notices have you gotten over the course of the past 30 or 45 days concerning releases of violent felons in your jurisdiction?
Well, I've had a minimum of 3 that involved either murder or capital murder, and I had others released on top of that that had extremely violent crimes or were convicted and had, like one had 6 previous parole violations and was paroled again for the 7th time, and one had 3 parole violations and was also released as well. So I've got a list as long as your arm that has come in the last month alone, probably 7 or 8 in the last month. And that doesn't count what I got in the month before that.
So have you had an opportunity to provide feedback concerning these parolees before they've been released? Certainly
No,
you have.
I
right?
have had no opportunity whatsoever for any input on it. The only thing I've gotten is what I would call a form 1-sentence letter that says you're being advised that this inmate is going to be released within 30 days, and or if they may have to go through some reentry, some program. But as I understand it, there are no programs operating right now. So the bottom line is they're going out of there as fast as they can get the paperwork done, is what it looks like.
And by programs, are you talking about reentry programs?
Yes. And
but counseling, education.
Those are kind of on hold right now. They're not even doing those.
So these folks are just walking out of the prison gates and right back into their communities.
That is correct.
All right, so let's talk about one. And you weren't just recently elected Commonwealth Attorney. How long have you been Commonwealth Attorney?
Over 40 years.
So most of these folks are folks that you prosecuted.
I prosecuted some of them, and or somebody in my office prosecuted them, and I'm very familiar with all of them.
Well, let's talk about one. Tell us about Patrick Schooley.
Patrick Schooley was a case that I personally prosecuted. He was an individual that came to Suffolk from Shreveport, Louisiana. He was about, I believe, 16 or so when he came. He was visiting his uncle. And near his uncle lived a lady named Bessie Roundtree, who was 78 years old. He went to Miss Roundtree's back door, knocked on her door, and told her he wanted to use her telephone. He needed to make a telephone call. But it was really a ruse to rob her is what it was about. When he got in the house, he then demanded money from her. And of course, she willingly complied, gave him exactly everything he asked for. And he then told her he wanted her to go with him. So he went out, got the keys to her car, took her in the car and drove her down the road. I think he wasn't sure exactly what he wanted to do with her at that point. He then brought her back to the home, meaning her home where she was. And he went in and he took her into her bedroom and raped her in her bedroom. And after he finished raping her, he then stabbed her with a knife and murdered her. And as a result of that, he was convicted of capital murder, of capital murder. He was convicted of abduction, and he was convicted of capital murder in the commission of rape, abduction and robbery, and he received 3 life sentences for those crimes.
And what is Patrick Schooley's status right now as we speak?
To my knowledge, he has been released. I am told, but I don't know for a fact, I am told he has been released to Northern Virginia. And I don't know if that's true, but I'm told, but I don't know that for a fact.
Well, how did you learn that Patrick Schooley was even under consideration for release?
Well, let me say 2 things. Number one, I got no letter of any kind in his case from the parole board stating he was going to be paroled at all.
You mean even as of today?
None, 0, nothing. In addition to that, the victim's family, to my knowledge, has never been notified or asked for input or anything on this particular case regarding Schooley. In addition to that, the only notice I got was from the Department of Corrections. It was dated April 29th, and it said he was going to be released on April 30. So I got 1 day's notice from the Department of Corrections, not the parole board.
So I take it that with 1 day's notice before his release, you had no opportunity to have any input with the parole board. At that point, decision had already been made to grant his parole. Did you do anything? Ask them to reconsider.
I did not ask for reconsideration because he'd already been released and he was gone. And there is a serious question, and I'm not sure, but it would seem to me there is a serious question that once they're released, the question becomes whether he has certain due process rights relating to his ability to, unless he commits a new crime, to be brought back on parole. Now, if he hadn't been released, it might be a different animal. But once they're released, I would think it could present some difficult legal issues. I can't say for certain, but I would think it could be very difficult. And it seems to me that if they have taken that step and never even notified me in the first instance, they're not going to pay much attention to anything I have to say anyway, because they've already made up their mind what they're going to do. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is this didn't occur just in Suffolk, but it's occurring all over the state of Virginia. And there is clearly an agenda, both by the parole board and in my judgment, by the Northam administration, to release as many of these people as they can get by with doing. And they've done so under the cover of COVID virus, because this is where everybody's attention is today, and they figured nobody would pay any attention to what's going on. That's my view.
Yeah, you know, you and I have talked about this back last month when we were in Richmond for the veto session of the General Assembly. the governor had actually offered an amendment to the budget that he had requested, giving him certain discretionary authority to, I guess, help reduce prison population in response to the COVID crisis. And that discretionary authority was limited to people who were not convicted of Class 1 felonies, and they had to be within the last year of their sentence. And clearly, Patrick Schooley didn't qualify under either of those categories, right?
He did not qualify, but Patrick Schooley was eligible for parole because his crime occurred prior to 1995 and to 1995. So he was technically eligible to be paroled. And there's no question, but I was never given any opportunity for input, nor was the victim's family given any opportunity for input relating to that case. And when you look at the facts of that case, they are totally egregious in the worst sense. I cannot fathom anybody committing a more heinous crime than the rape and robbery and abduction and murder of a 78-year-old woman in her own home. I mean, how outrageous a human being. To me, it shows no humanity whatsoever, zero, none.
So, you know, you mentioned that he was convicted prior to 1995, and
yes,
that was the year that truth in sentencing was adopted. The bipartisan legislation that was proposed when George Allen was governor that basically did away with the parole system that was allowing people to get out of prison decades before the end of their sentence. And as you pointed out, he was eligible for parole, but the fact that he was eligible did not mean that the parole board was operating under any mandate or any obligation to parole him just because he was eligible. So you've been prosecutor for over 40 years, and you've had an opportunity to see the difference that the truth in sentencing has made. Has it made a difference in your observation?
It has made an enormous difference. I found prior to truth in sentencing, which came into effect in 1995, I would see people that would get 50, 60-year sentences released after serving 1/6 of their sentence. People would be released 20-year sentence and be released in 3.5 years. It was incredible how quickly they were getting turned around. It was like a revolving door. And then when the truth in sentencing came in 95, and I might add, it was a bipartisan issue. It was done at that time with a predominantly Democratic legislature and Governor Allen. So this was a bipartisan deal. This was not either Republican or Democrat. I mean, it was done to try to truly call sentencing what it is, where it's true. And you know, whatever you get, you serve. I mean, you get 15% off for good behavior, well, and that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But the bottom line is, since then, to give you an example, in 1985 or the mid 80s, we had in Suffolk, which at that time had about 60,000 people, we had 16 murders in 1 year. In contrast, within the last 5 to 6 years, our general murder rate in Suffolk, which now has about 90,000 people, has been 2 to 3 a year. Make no mistake, it has made a difference. Our crime rates have gone down. Suffolk has a very low crime rate now, especially compared to the mid 80s. So in my opinion, it has had an enormously positive impact on public safety by the abolition of parole.
And you know, one additional consideration that I've heard is that with the advent of truth in sentencing, jurors know when they sentence somebody to life, life means life. And many who have concerns about the death penalty and about its fair application have actually commented, and some actually supported truth in sentencing upon the grounds that it was going to reduce the frequency of the application of capital punishment. Juries were going to impose it less frequently. Has that been borne out in your observations?
Absolutely. We've had, I personally prosecuted one case involving an individual in the mid-80s named Coleman Wayne Gray. He actually got the death sentence and it was carried out 14 years later. In contrast, since 1995, I've had no murder cases or capital murder cases that have resulted in a death sentence being granted. And if you look on a statewide basis, the number of death sentences today, because we have life without parole, the number of death sentences you get is very, very small compared to what we had before. Because when life means life, jurors will do that. But if life doesn't mean life, then jurors don't want to see this individual back on the street.
Phil, we're about to run out of time, but my understanding is that you have a couple of other cases that you may want to mention briefly. You want to talk for a minute about Dwayne Reed and the parole decision that was made with respect to him and his case?
Reed was an individual that was committed a crime involving a couple of robberies and actually the murder of an individual when he was a juvenile at 14. As a result of that, he ultimately ended up going to the Department of Corrections, where he's not Department of Corrections, but juvenile justice, because he was too young to be transferred and tried as an adult. He stayed up there for 9 months, came back to Suffolk, and within 7 months, he murdered another individual. It was a drug deal. A 32-year-old individual came up and was going to buy drugs from Reed. Reed actually handed him a rock, not of cocaine, but an actual rock. And the guy simply said, "Hey, this isn't cocaine, this is just a rock." And he shot him in the head almost for the pleasure of it. And as a result of that, he was sentenced and got a life in the penitentiary for the murder, 10 years for the 2 firearm charges, and he got a life suspended sentence on the armed robbery charge. And he was released, and I think he was 43 years old when he was released.
So it's not not a geriatric release.
Oh, absolutely not geriatric under any circumstances. So that was his case. And in addition to that,
let me ask you about that. I mean, were you given notice or victim's family given notice in that case either?
Absolutely not. And in fact, no, we were given, I got a letter from the parole board. It was the form letter that said he's going to be released within 30 days or if he's finished some reentry program. And lo and behold, within a matter of days almost, or a very short period of time, he was back on the street. He put up a website, so he had his own Facebook page. He was in there on Facebook page, and so we knew he was back in Suffolk. So I know he's in Suffolk, and so that's where we've got with Mr. Reed. So he also was convicted of capital murder, back on the street, even after having committed not only the most recent murder, but prior to that as a juvenile, within a short time he had murdered there. So he's killed 2 people at least. And then, so that was Dwayne Reed. And then I have one other, his name was Irvin Cotton. Irvin Cotton was a case that I personally prosecuted. And Mr. Cotton was convicted his wife had a charge against him for domestic violence. And his wife was scheduled to come to court the next day after the murder occurred. I mean, it was for a hearing. And he went in the day before that hearing, broke into her parents' house where she was with her 2 children, and took a gun and shot her twice in the presence of her 4-year and 8-year-old children, and murdered her in her parents' house. And so he received a sentence of life in prison as well. And so now he has come out, and so we got that parole on him. So we've had 3 in Suffolk of these kind of homicides within less than 30 days.
Yet, you know, in the years that you have been Commonwealth's attorney, ever since the abolition of parole, have you ever seen a month like the past month in terms of grants of parole to violent felons by any parole board, whether appointed by Republican or Democrat in the governor's mansion?
Absolutely not. I have never in my life, in the whole time I've been a prosecutor, seen anything remotely similar to what has occurred within this 30-day period. And the people they are releasing are the absolute worst of the worst. They're the people that have committed the most violent crimes we have under the law. And it's just incomprehensible to me how these kind of decisions can be made. It's just incredible. I mean, I'm incredulous. And what people need to understand is one other thing that I think is important. When these people are released, the impact that it has on the victims' families is enormous. These people are so outraged, you can't even fathom how upset they are, for lack of a better way to put it. And we have unfortunately gotten to a very simple point. Criminals are now being treated like victims, and victims and their families are being totally ignored. That is the reality of what is occurring and has occurred. And it is a really, really sad situation. For whatever it's worth, I have done a television shows and on these issues here locally. And there has also been newspaper articles written about these things in Suffolk. And I have had not one person that has had anything positive to say about what is going on. In fact, people are so outraged and incredulous, you just would not believe how they're just amazed and they're outraged. There's no other way to describe these kind of people that are being released on the streets. They just want nothing to do because it's a public safety issue, pure and simple. It is nothing else. And I want to add, because I think this is important on 3 cases we had in Suffolk. Schooley was a white male that killed a white female. Reed was a black male that killed a white male. Cotton was a black male that killed a black female. So if you look at the people that are being released, the victims in these cases were black, white, male, and female, all across the board. In the same way with the defendants. So none of this has anything to do with race whatsoever. And anybody that would allege anything of that sort is totally not telling the truth.
Well, Phil, we're out of time. I want to thank you for your bold statements, not just today, but standing up and being a voice for public safety in your community and around the state, and being a voice for victims in connection with what's going on with the parole board. You know, it's my hope that Republicans, Democrats, and independents are going to take notice of this increasingly. I hope that they will take notice of it in time for us to prevent some serious crimes and repercussions as a result of this. I think that the actions of this parole board has undermined the interests of community safety across the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we're going to keep talking about it. Tomorrow, we have former Governor George Allen, who's going to be joining with us, giving us a little bit of history, talking about the old days before the abolition of parole, in which we had a dishonest and liberal system of parole that was churning people out of prison just about as fast as the parole board has been doing over the course of the past month. And it ought to be interesting. Governor Allen's always a lot of fun to talk to. Phil, thank you very much for what you do, and thank you for joining me today.
And thank you very much for the invitation, and I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you again.
Look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks.
Have a nice evening.